There are moments in history that do not announce themselves with fanfare. No press conference, no ultimatum, just a single aircraft, an unmarked diplomatic manifest, and a runway in Tehran that the world's most sophisticated surveillance apparatus somehow failed to flag until the wheels had already touched down. That aircraft, if the intelligence assessments circulating among senior analysts are accurate, carried something that no amount of diplomatic language can fully disguise. The most senior Chinese military official to set foot on Iranian soil in over 2 decades, arriving not during a peace conference, not during a multilateral summit, not during any occasion that Washington would have been invited to attend, arriving instead in the middle of a period that the Pentagon has chosen to describe as, and this is the phrase that should concern you, a period of strategic reassessment. Strategic reassessment. Write that down, because in the language of the American defense establishment, strategic reassessment is what happens when the assumptions the entire architecture of your global strategy rested upon have just been quietly invalidated, and no one inside the building has yet agreed on how to say that out loud. China's defense minister did not land in Tehran to deliver a lecture. He did not land there to shake hands in front of cameras. He landed there because something shifted in the calculation that Beijing has been running for a very long time, and the shift was significant enough to require a face-to-face conversation at the highest possible military level, in person, in a city that Washington still treats as the center of the axis it has been trying to dismantle for 45 years. The question before you tonight is not whether this happened. It happened. The question is what it means. And what it means is not what anyone on your television is going to tell you. Before we can understand what is happening now, we have to go back to October of 1962. Not because of the missiles, though the missiles matter, because of what the Cuban Missile Crisis revealed about the limits of American strategic omniscience. For 13 days, the most powerful military in the world, with the most sophisticated intelligence apparatus ever assembled, sat at the edge of nuclear annihilation, not because it lacked information, but because it fundamentally misread the behavior of 2 actors it had spent years studying. It misread Khrushchev. It misread Castro. It applied American strategic logic to men operating inside completely different civilizational frameworks, and it nearly ended the world because of it. Kennedy's advisors were not stupid. They were not incompetent. They were imprisoned by a model that assumed everyone on the other side of the board was playing the same game. They were not. And the lesson of those 13 days, the lesson that every serious strategist spent the next 3 decades trying to institutionalize, is that the moment your adversary moves in a direction that does not fit your model, your first instinct is almost always wrong. There is another dimension of 1962 that almost never gets mentioned in the standard telling. While the world's attention was fixed on Cuba, on the naval blockade, on the photographs of Soviet ships and the countdown clocks in the situation rooms of Washington and Moscow, something else was happening in parallel. The non-aligned movement, the coalition of states that had refused to anchor themselves to either superpower, was watching. They were watching with a precision and a strategic patience that neither Washington nor Moscow fully appreciated at the time. What they saw in those 13 days was not a confrontation between 2 giants. What they saw was a demonstration of the costs of dependence. They saw that when 2 nuclear powers stare at each other across a maritime corridor, the states in between, Cuba, Turkey, the nations whose territory and waters and airspace and economies formed the actual battleground of the confrontation, had no seat at the table, no voice, no agency. The decisions were made in Washington and Moscow. Everyone else waited. And from that observation, a generation of leaders drew a conclusion that is still shaping the world tonight. Strategic independence is not a luxury, it is a survival mechanism. And the price of alignment with a superpower is the surrendering of exactly the agency that your civilizational survival ultimately depends on. Iran has never forgotten that lesson. China has never forgotten that Iran never forgot it. And the man who just landed on that Tehran runway understands both of those facts with a clarity that suggests this visit was not improvised. It was prepared. And the preparation tells you something about the timeline. The Pentagon went quiet after the landing was confirmed. That silence is not confusion. Confusion produces press conferences, it produces briefings, it produces leaks of disagreement designed to signal internal debate. The Pentagon produced none of these. What it produced was a coordinated, deliberate institutional silence, the kind of silence that in Cold War terminology had a specific name. It was called the assessment window, the window during which the formal response is not yet decided, and during which any premature public statement risks closing off options that the institution is not yet ready to close. The Pentagon is inside that window, and the window, based on the timeline since the landing, is longer than anything the current administration has produced in response to any prior geopolitical development. That length is itself data. Something about what happened in Tehran does not fit the existing response playbook. And when the playbook doesn't fit, the institution goes quiet while it writes a new one. Let me tell you what is not happening. What is not happening is a simple arms transfer conversation. The framework for that already exists. The back channels for that are already established. You do not fly your defense minister into Tehran with all the diplomatic exposure that entails, with all the signals it sends to every intelligence service in the Middle East and Europe and the American mainland, simply to discuss a transaction that could have been handled through 3 levels of intermediary. You do that level of visit, defense minister, in person, in Tehran, for one of exactly 2 reasons. The first reason is a formal commitment, a commitment that requires a signature at a level senior enough to be binding under the internal governance structures of both states. The second reason is a warning, not a warning to Iran, but a warning delivered through Iran to a third party, calculated to travel through exactly the channels that a direct communication would not. Either of those 2 reasons, and I want you to sit with this for a moment, either of those 2 reasons represents a departure from everything Beijing has done in its Iran posture for the past 15 years. For 15 years, China has maintained a precise and deliberate ambiguity in its relationship with Tehran. Trade, yes. Energy, yes. Quiet diplomatic cover at the United Nations, yes. But formal military commitment, the kind that triggers alliance logic, the kind that would force Beijing to choose between its Iranian relationship and its relationship with the global financial system it has spent decades penetrating, that kind of commitment China has refused to make, deliberately, publicly, because the ambiguity was itself the strategy. As long as Washington couldn't be certain whether China would intervene in a conflict involving Iran, it had to plan for the possibility that it would. And planning for that possibility consumed American strategic bandwidth, limited American military options, and forced American planners into a level of caution that served Beijing's interests precisely. Ambiguity in strategic competition is not a failure of resolve, it is a weapon. Beijing has been wielding it for 15 years. The defense minister just landed in Tehran. The ambiguity may be over. Now I want you to think about something concrete. There are 47 American military installations within a 1,200-mile radius of Tehran. 47 aircraft carriers, forward operating bases, signals intelligence stations, logistics hubs, the entire physical infrastructure of American power projection in the Middle East. All of it sits within what military planners call the first strike radius of any serious regional conflict involving Iran. 47 installations. The people inside those installations have not been sent home. They have not been put on elevated alert status in any way that has been publicly acknowledged. But in every serious strategic planning environment right now, the question being asked is not what did the defense minister say. The question is what happens to those 47 installations if the calculation changed. Let that number settle. 47. The scale of what is at stake in that question is not abstract. Consider what the American strategic architecture in this region actually rests on. It rests on 3 pillars. The first pillar is military guarantee, the credible promise that the carrier groups, the forward bases, the extended deterrence network will respond to aggression against American partners faster and more decisively than any adversary can respond. The second pillar is economic integration, the dollar settlement system, the SWIFT network, the financial infrastructure through which energy revenues flow and through which access to global capital markets is controlled. The third pillar is information dominance, the ability to shape the narrative of events, to define what is a provocation and what is a defensive response, to set the terms of the story that the rest of the world reads about what is happening. These 3 pillars, military, economic, informational, are what the architecture actually is. They are not metaphors, they are operational systems, and they are not equally fragile. What Beijing has understood for 20 years is that you do not need to defeat all 3 pillars simultaneously. You need only to introduce sufficient doubt about the first pillar to begin the structural erosion of the second and third. Because the second and third pillars are built on the credibility of the first. Once the Gulf states, the energy producers, the sovereign wealth funds that intermediate between oil revenues and global markets, Once those actors update their probability models about how reliably and how exclusively Washington can provide the security guarantee, the economic and informational pillars begin to shift, not collapse, shift, slowly, structurally, in ways that don't produce a headline for months or years. But the shift, once begun, follows its own logic, the logic of insurance. No rational actor maintains only one form of coverage when a second option becomes available and the cost of the first begins to look uncertain. This is not about ideology. It is about institutional risk management. Apply that logic to the Strait of Hormuz and everything becomes fully concrete. 21% of the world's oil transits that strait every year. 21%. Every serious military planner on Earth has a Hormuz scenario. Every serious financial institution has a Hormuz scenario. Every sovereign wealth fund, every energy ministry, every central bank that holds dollar reserves against oil revenues, all of them keep a probability estimate attached to the scenario, and that probability is not a number that appears in any press release. It is a number that gets embedded into decision-making about where to hold currency reserves, how to structure long-term energy contracts, whether to invest in pipeline redundancy, whether to deepen a relationship with one security guarantor or quietly diversify toward two. The probability lives inside institutions, not in newspapers. And when it moves, even by small percentages, even in ways that produce no public signal, the behavior of every institution that carries it begins to shift, slowly and then all at once. The defense minister's landing moved that probability in every institution that models it, not to a crisis threshold, but measurably in the direction that Beijing has been trying to move it for 2 decades. Now, I want you to think about what happens downstream when that probability moves. Think about the institutional cascade. It begins in the risk management departments of the sovereign wealth funds, the institutions that manage the accumulated oil revenues of the Gulf states, the institutions that hold trillions of dollars in assets denominated in currencies whose stability depends on the energy settlement architecture remaining intact. When those institutions update their Hormuz probability, they update their currency hedging. When they update their currency hedging, the demand for dollar-denominated instruments adjusts by fractions of a percentage. Those fractions, multiplied across trillions of dollars of managed assets, are not fractions. They are hundreds of billions of dollars moving in a direction. That movement does not produce a press release. It produces a quarterly report that a small number of analysts read very carefully. But those analysts sit at the desks of the institutions that set the terms of the global financial architecture. And when they update their models, the institutions update their behavior. And when the institutions update their behavior, the governments that depend on those institutions update their posture. And when the governments update their posture, the alliances that those governments anchor begin to shift. This is not a theory. This is the mechanism. This is precisely how British sterling lost its status as the world's reserve currency across the 30 years following the Second World War. Not in a single event, not through a single decision, through the accumulation of probability adjustments made inside institutions, compounding across decades until the day that the mathematics of the accumulated adjustments could no longer be ignored. The difference between now and the British sterling case is speed. The sterling transition took 30 years because the information moved slowly, the institutions updated slowly, and the alternatives emerged slowly. Today, the information moves in seconds, the institutions update in quarters, and the alternative, the yuan, the basket settlement frameworks that China has been building through the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and the BRICS payment architecture, those alternatives did not exist 30 years ago. They exist now. They are not ready to replace the dollar system. They are ready to provide the optionality that changes the price of the dollar system. And optionality, not replacement, is what changes the behavior of the institutions that matter. The Cuban Missile Crisis ended not because of the blockade, it ended because Kennedy and Khrushchev found a back channel through which they could exchange the actual terms that neither side could say publicly. The missiles in Cuba came down, the American missiles in Turkey came down, and for decades the Turkey withdrawal was classified because the formal narrative required that America appear to have won without conceding anything. The real settlement was invisible. The public story was the theater. This is how great power conflict operates at the highest levels. The visible move is never the whole move. And what makes tonight's situation distinct from 1962 is not the weapons or the geography. It is that in 1962, The back channel ran between two parties. Tonight, the number of parties with independent leverage over the outcome has multiplied. The back channel, if it exists, is not a single line. It is a network. And networks of this complexity do not produce clean settlements. They produce drift. Structural drift toward an outcome that no single actor designed and no single actor controls. And that drift, invisible, institutional, compounding, is already underway. It was underway before the defense minister's aircraft took off. What the landing did was accelerate it, not by changing the direction of drift, but by changing its velocity, by making the probability update inside every relevant institution larger and faster than it would otherwise have been, by sending a signal, clear enough to read, that the period of ambiguity, the 15-year period during which the question of whether Beijing would formally enter the regional security equation was deliberately left open, may have ended. That signal, once sent, cannot be unsent. The institutions that received it have already begun adjusting. The adjustments are not reversible. The drift is now faster, and faster drift in a system as large and as interconnected as the global energy and financial architecture does not produce linear outcomes. It produces threshold effects, slow, then sudden. Here is what nobody is telling you tonight. This is the level at which the real game is being played, not the level of weapons, not the level of military posture, not the level that the 24-hour news cycle is capable of processing or the press briefing system capable of acknowledging. The level of institutional probability adjustment, compounding quietly across every finance ministry and sovereign wealth fund and central bank in the region, reshaping the architecture of global power through the accumulated weight of risk models updated by people whose names you will never read in any newspaper. The real story of the landing is not about what was said inside those rooms in Tehran. The real story is about what the landing communicates to an audience that was not in the room. That audience is not sitting in Washington. That audience is sitting in Riyadh, in Abu Dhabi, in Doha, in every capital whose sovereign wealth fund manages the revenues of an energy economy that has for half a century priced its product in dollars, settled its transactions through American-controlled infrastructure, and anchored its security to an American guarantee. That audience watched a Chinese defense minister land in Tehran, and every one of them ran the same calculation simultaneously. If Beijing has crossed the threshold of ambiguity, if it has moved from the strategic gray zone into something that resembles commitment, then the insurance policy that every Gulf state has been paying into for 5 decades is no longer the only policy on the market. A second policy is now visible. Not necessarily cheaper, not necessarily more reliable, but visible. And the moment a second option becomes visible to a risk manager, the price of the first option changes. This is not ideology. This is not alliance politics. This is the structural logic of institutional hedging. And it is the logic that is going to determine the shape of the next decade more than any weapon transfer, any naval exercise, or any statement delivered from a podium in Washington. The Cuban Missile Crisis ended not because of the blockade, it ended because Kennedy and Khrushchev found a back channel through which they could exchange the actual terms that neither side could say publicly. The missiles in Cuba came down, the American missiles in Turkey came down, and for decades the Turkey withdrawal was classified because the formal narrative required that America appear to have won without conceding anything. The real settlement was invisible. The public story was the theater. This is how great power conflict operates at the highest levels. The visible move is never the whole move. And what makes tonight's situation distinct from 1962 is not the weapons or the geography. It is that in 1962, the back channel ran between two parties. Tonight, the number of parties with independent leverage over the outcome has multiplied. The back channel, if it exists, is not a single line. It is a network. And networks of this complexity do not produce clean settlements. They produce drift. Structural drift toward an outcome that no single actor designed and no single actor controls. 3 predictions, stated as clearly as I can state them. Prediction 1. Within 60 days, at least one Gulf state that has publicly maintained alignment with Washington will initiate a formal bilateral security dialogue with Beijing, conducted through back channels that never make it into the public record, framed on the surface as an economic conversation, but carrying the content of a security hedge. The Gulf states learned from the reorganizations of the past several years that the United States is capable of restructuring its regional architecture without consulting the interests of states it has formally guaranteed. They will not repeat the experience of being reorganized without agency. They will seek alternatives. The defense minister's landing just made the alternative appear more credible. And credibility, in the insurance logic of geopolitics, is the entire product. Prediction 2. The dollar share of Gulf energy settlement transactions will decline by a measurable percentage before the end of this calendar year, not in a way that produces a headline, but in a way visible in the quarterly data of the institutions that track these flows. Every basis point of shift in settlement currency is a vote. Not a vote against the dollar, a vote for optionality. And optionality, once established, does not reverse easily. Prediction 3. The American response, when it comes, and it will come, because institutional silence of this duration always eventually breaks, will be framed as reassurance to allies rather than confrontation with Beijing. It will involve carrier group positioning and bilateral security reaffirmations and statements about the inviolability of freedom of navigation. All of these are real signals of American capability. None of them address the actual strategic challenge, which is not military. The capability is not in question. The relevance of the capability is in question, and that question cannot be answered by a carrier group. I might be wrong about whether this visit was a commitment or a warning. I might be wrong about the timeline on the Gulf state hedging, but the structural logic has been operating for 20 years. The defense minister's landing did not create it. It revealed it, chose to reveal it, at a moment of Beijing's choosing, for reasons that the next several weeks will begin to make visible. The world that existed before that aircraft touched down in Tehran is not the world that exists tonight. The world that exists tomorrow has not yet been written, and the people who will write it are the ones who understand tonight that the visible event and the real event are not the same thing. The distance between the map and the territory, in great power competition, is the problem. Tonight, the territory moved.